turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. That's where we're going to be this morning. I hope you've been blessed as we've been walking through these passages. I am pleased this morning that I do not have as many as I did last time I was up here. If you were here that Sunday, man, I had a lot to get through. Today, I only have two teachings of Jesus I get to get through, all right? And they're both really good, really full and rich, and do relate in a great way. Today, we're going to talk about treasures that matter. And you may have been around this passage, part of the passage before. You may have heard a sermon on this before. But as I got ready for this message, I thought, man, we all need to come to points in our lives where we're reminded of the things that matter, that truly matter in life. And I don't care how old you are in this room, how much life you've lived. The reality is we all have moments that we need to come back to the point and remember what Jesus says about things that matter. And so to get you there, let me just give you kind of a fun illustration to get us started thinking this morning. Have you ever seen some things that people value in life that you go, why in the world do they value this? Somebody's collected something, somebody has held on to something, maybe somebody's got a hobby that you just don't relate to and it costs or it has a lot of value attached to it, and you've heard somebody describe it to you and when you left the conversation you go, I have no clue why they care that much about that thing. You ever been there? Well, as I thought about this, the Waldrop household in particular, when I was growing up, my family, we were deeply tied, and part of my childhood, I had a great childhood, partly because of the craze of Beanie Babies. Anybody remember the Beanie Baby craze in the 90s? Were you around that at all? All right. Well, we did not collect Beanie Babies in the Waldrop household. Instead, my father made a lot of good money off of Beanie Babies. All right. And Dad, I'm sorry if you're watching to be sharing your news to the world, but it's way past that stage, so I think you'll be okay with this. But my dad was, he had dabbled in sports cards, and he was already connected online to some things back in that day that were before eBay, pre-eBay. It was all text-based, blue screen dial-up called Sportsnet. And the Beanie Baby thing started coming around Sportsnet, and my dad got heavily into it. I mean, so heavily so that when I came home some days in my early high school days, or maybe it was late middle school, I can't quite remember, but I do remember this. Our dining room was full of piles of frogs and bears and rabbits and elephants. And Shiloh's laughing. I'll share her story in a minute on why she's laughing. She knows this because there were piles, and we would come home from high school with my mom and my brother. My dad was still at his day job, and we would pack boxes of shipments. Okay, 5 frogs here, 6 bears there, and we'd pack these boxes, seal them up, and go to UPS. And I can remember doing that almost daily for months. I can remember that being part of our routine as a household. And I remember fancy cars driving up to my house to buy Beanie Babies worth $5,000. Now, my dad did not make $5,000, all right, to be real clear, but he was buying them for whatever and then selling them for a small margin there, right? He was finding these things all across the world. And we even got so into it that if you remember the McDonald's Beanie Babies, well, my dad got connected to the local guy that owned all the McDonald's, and we were going out the back door with them before anybody got to the McDonald's to buy them. We were bringing boxes out, all right? But here's what I thought about. There's 2 things I thought about when I thought about treasures that matter. The first is this. Toward the end of the craze, we had a run where we got, I don't know, it was probably 20 boxes full of teeny Beanie Babies from McDonald's. And it was at the end of the craze, and it was the final one that we made a mistake on. It was the only mistake my dad made during that time. And we ended up with those 20 boxes in our basement until I graduated college. I can remember them being down there. Before they built their next house and moved, we actually got rid of them and gave them to Goodwill. And Shiloh probably regrets that to this day, but here's why she's laughing is just recently, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 years ago, my dad's business partner kept some tubs full of Beanie Babies, probably 3 or 4 tubs, and brought them to my dad. He thought one day they'd be back in style, and they didn't, of course. And so there was a season at my dad's house when Shiloh and my 2 nephews were coming through at that time that they would just go to Rookie's house, and they just get a Beanie Baby out of the tub every time. And so now Shiloh's room is full of bears and frogs and whatever else from that day because she of course loved that and thought it was awesome. But isn't it interesting how toward the end of that craze, when nobody cared about it, they went from treasure to junk very quickly. And that's what I thought about is how fast things in life become treasure and then they turn to junk. Think about your life and the things you've bought, the things you've done with your finances, right? I mean, we all have these hobbies, these interests, these things, and before you know it, these things we invest so much time, energy, and money into, they turn to junk. And Jesus is going to say that. We're going to see this in Matthew 6. But before we go into the text, I want you to remember this, to think about this. The important treasures of life are in places that no one sees. No one but you and Jesus. We're going to see today that Jesus is going to show us, both based on fasting, a religious practice, and based on what you do with your resource, materialism. He's going to show you that the important things in life are in the places that no one can see. Only you and Jesus. And here's the question for our day before we get in the text. Are you storing up treasures that matter? The real question as we come to this part of the text is, are we spending our lives storing up junk or storing up things that matter? So with all that being said, with all that context to start, let's jump into the text for a second. Matthew chapter 6, we're going to start in verse 16 and read through 24. Read with me. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? For no one can serve two masters, for they either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And it's two interesting texts to think about treasure, all right? And I know with the first part with fasting, you're going to go, how does that relate to treasure, Bo? Like, how in the world are we going to get there? Well, here's the thing you've got to realize when it came to fasting. Fasting was one of the major practices of Jesus' day. It was practiced even more so than what the Bible commanded them. If you look back to the Old Testament commands, you see fasting commanded on the Day of Atonement, but you really don't see it commanded in other places. But the Pharisees took this practice and they made it more prominent. And then on top of that, what happened is there started to be rituals that you could see and know if someone was actually practicing fasting. And you know, as I thought about this, I thought about other spiritual disciplines. Now, hear me clearly as we go to this part of the text for a second. You have to have spiritual discipline to really receive what Jesus is saying here. Let me say that again. You have to have spiritual disciplines to really receive what Jesus is saying here. So what that means is, like, if you don't have consistent practices in your life of faith, well, then it's hard to, people that have a lot of grace-filled lives, it's hard to receive this because, man, sometimes we just want to lay back if we're not careful in our faith journey. But all of us in this room have some practices of faith. For instance, church attendance, or perhaps Bible study or reading. Maybe it's your prayer life. Maybe there is a fasting moment in your life. I'll be real honest with you. As I came to this text, I realized how few and far between I have ever fasted in my life. But there are spiritual practices that if I'm not careful, I do the same things as the Pharisees were doing here. So hear me clearly. I'm not saying that you should not fast. In fact, I believe sometimes fasting can be a great thing for your life. But you also have to bring this into modern context and go, okay, what are the disciplines in my life of faith? And here's the ultimate thing. Here's the treasure. The treasure is when you turn that discipline and make sure that it's authentic in worship. The treasure of authentic worship of God. But because you see, any practice that's not personal and does not have your heart attached to it, guess what? That practice is religion. And Jesus came to disrupt religion. He didn't throw it away. He didn't get rid of the practices. He actually says he came to fulfill the law, right? So we know he came to emphasize what God did. But God set up these things in our lives not to be drudgery, not to be routine, definitely not to be dead religion. Instead, he set these things up, these disciplines up, so that our hearts may come alive. So here's the first thing I think we want to do if we want to have authentic worship. We have to have a heart checkup. When it comes to your practice of faith, you need to occasionally have a heart checkup in your life. That's what Jesus was saying in this text is when you fast, why are you fasting? What is your heart motive behind it? Not what does the practice do. We know what the practice does. You in that time, you take away food, and you don't eat, and you make sure in that time you put on certain things to look like you're struggling through this, and you're humbling yourself. There was all kinds of ritualistic things connected to fasting. And Jesus asked the question, why? What's the motive of your heart behind this? And you see what he's saying when he tells the believers or the people listening, he says, hey, instead of doing that, do it a different way. What he's saying is, if your motive is self-centered and self-interested in your worship, then you've already got it wrong. And boy, I don't have time to preach on that, but let me just say, we all have to be careful for consumeristic types of worship. Worship that is about our own fulfillment, our own desires, our self-interest, rather than worship being about connecting us to a personal God who loves us, wants to know us, and be intimate with us. That is the reason we do anything in faith. But it's so interesting, man. Man, I'm telling you, like even in my life as a pastor, these things that we do can so become about ourselves if we're not careful. They can either become checklists that we check off to make ourselves feel like we've done the right thing by God. I always joked in New Orleans, I know none of y'all are like this here, but when I stood in the lobby in my church in New Orleans, and it's a Catholic culture, so there's some religion rooted in a lot of the practices of faith, but I mean, I would have someone walk into church. We started church at 11 and we were done by noon. I'd have somebody walk into church at 11:55. 11:55. I mean, I know we're not all, I'm not getting on to anybody who's not prompt in here. It's not about that at all. But 11:55 tells me you've missed the day, right? Like most people will say, all right, it's just time to go to lunch. Like, we didn't make church today. But you know what I really believe the heart of that was? Check. We got into God's house. And listen, I'm not throwing shade at the 11:55 person. Listen to me very carefully. How many of us show up early and do the same thing? Check. 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 Right? God intended worship to be more than church attendance and a checkbox, a daily Bible study in your checkbox. Again, if you don't have these disciplines, I'm not speaking to you. So if you have trouble coming to church, trouble reading your Bible, trouble praying daily, like if you have trouble in these disciplines, Jesus is not talking to you. He's really not right here. We're going to get to something in a minute that will relate to you. But if you've developed the practices in your life, Jesus is saying, be careful of the check boxes. Because at some point in your life, you can miss the heart of what it's really all about. And I don't want any of us to miss the heart of why we're here, the heart of what's in His Word. But so many times our ability to rely on comfort and the lack of change will lead us into complacency. Comfort and change, lack of change, leads you into complacency. Let me remind you of something Timothy says. Paul says to Timothy, the aim of our charge is love that issues from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. The reality is that we want to have pure hearts, good conscience, and sincere faith. Augustine of Hippo, he said this in one of the commentaries I was reading. It is clear that by these precepts, talking about this command about fasting, it's clear that our whole intention is intended to be directed toward the joys that are within, lest we become conformed to this world by seeking the reward that is without, and lest we thus lose the promised blessedness, which is all the more sound and firm according as it is the inner man, the blessedness by which God has chosen us to be conformed to the image of His Son. Man, God, what He's saying there, if you can't get through some of the old English, let me just boil it down. God is not interested in your appearance, your check boxes, or the things you do. He's interested in the condition of your heart. Which leads into the next part when he talks about ultimately that we need to see it in secret, right? He talks about that your fasting may not be seen by others, but your Father who is in secret. The reality is our obedience, it really needs to be secret. You're not doing it to show off. You're not doing it to let others know. You're doing it because you love God, and that's good enough. The secret parts of our lives are the most dangerous, but it also can be the most rewarding. The most dangerous side is when you say to yourself, how in the world could this person do this? And you fill in the blank. They look like they've got it all together. They look like they love Jesus. They look like this, but they did this, right? Every time that happens, there's a secret part of their life that is left unchecked, is why that happened. And here's the question for you and me. What are your secret parts of life that you're leaving unchecked? And where in your secret parts of your life do you need to be more obedient to God? The secret parts of our lives can be the greatest barriers, and ultimately the public parts of our life, the things people see, have no relation to your inner part. They really don't. Let me give you an example from New Orleans about fasting. I love this, all right? So here's the thing about New Orleans culture. We're a Catholic culture. We have some traditions. And if you didn't know, by the way, Mardi Gras is just a big party before the big fast, right? That's what it was established for. Fat Tuesday was this big party thing because the season of Lent is coming on Ash Wednesday. And from Ash Wednesday to Easter, there's a season of fasting called Lent. Now listen, just like everything in church life, and this is no criticism to my Catholic brothers and sisters, listen, like everything, that has become a religious practice, all right? So much so that the Chick-fil-A serves fish on Fridays in New Orleans. If you ever want to have Chick-fil-A fish, go to New Orleans, because on Friday there's fish being served, all right? That was the oddest thing to me when I moved there and I showed up at Chick-fil-A on Friday. They're serving fish because they know that the customer base does not eat meat during Lent on Fridays. To this day, that is practiced. I can't tell you how many Catholics, at least in my family, have told me about the meaningful side of the sacrifice, but I know they don't eat meat on Fridays, the ones that practice. I know that about them, right? How many times are we just like that? We have these things that we put up in our lives that we say we practice, but the meaning behind them, the things God teaches us, are so minimal. Maybe we're not even listening, we just practice it instead. We come to church and we sit through a message, but we don't take anything home that we can apply. We go to Bible study, but we don't participate, or we don't even go to Bible study for that matter. Or maybe it's beyond all church things for a minute. Do we even get alone with before God in our prayer closets? Do we take time for Him? You see, the reality is the secret parts that matter. And the hardest thing about that is you don't judge Pastor Bo based on my secret parts. I don't get hired or fired based on the secret parts of my life, and the same goes for you too. People don't judge you or have an opinion on those secret parts of your life unless they play out in some way that culture or society does not appreciate. The secret parts are the things that matter and bring the most joy. The secret parts are the way our faith really starts to play out. It's all about the secret part of your heart that God has to speak to. And here's my encouragement for you today. When is the last time you took some time to dwell with and wrestle with those secret parts of your life? Maybe it's a sin pattern that you need to get right with God with. It's going to take some time. You're going to have some commitment. But nobody knows it. We look at each other and we don't know it. Perhaps it's just, man, there's some practices in my life that have become religious in nature. They have no meaning to them. I don't enjoy them. They've just become religious. And listen, those disciplines are there not to hold you in bondage, but to bring you closer to Jesus. That is why we do spiritual discipline. So perhaps for you, let me get to this passage. Psalm 119 says this. I love this. Incline my heart to your testimonies and not to selfish gain. Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things and give me life in your ways. What a great, I'm sorry, I about missed that, but it's just a great, speaks to the fact that we ultimately want to invest our lives in things that matter. Which leads us into materialism, treasures in heaven, all right? And here's the second treasure today, and they only got two. The treasure of authentic worship was the first one. The second one is the treasure of godly investments. The treasure of godly investments. So Jesus rolls out of this religious thing about your heart and secret obedience. And what I love is then he goes right into materialism. And that, if you didn't read through all that, that's what he's talking about, is materialism. And what's interesting to me is we can, as American culture, I can hit on us. I mean, I've done it before, right? Man, we're so wealthy. We have all this stuff. We're material. But here's what's interesting is, even in Jesus' day, no matter how much resource they had, there was a heart of materialism that he's speaking to in their day. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, even in their society, makes me think of other societies that maybe don't have as much as us, but yet still have to wrestle with the heart of materialism. And the reason is this, is as you look to the secret things of our lives, materialism can be the chief robber of all these things we just talked about. Of having a heart toward God, of having a heart for God, materialism, having things, is a thing we must watch. It's not evil in of itself. Having resource and having stuff is not evil of itself, but when you invest your heart into these things, that is where we begin to see problems. So what does he say here? Well, first, you know this, don't lay up treasures on earth, but treasures in heaven, right? What he's talking about is, are you having lasting possessions? Are you acquiring things for your life that last? Your house one day will be destroyed. They ever seen, I'm sure in Norcross it's happened a lot in New Orleans, they buy a piece of property with an old house on it, they level it to the ground. You seen that before? And then they build up a brand new house on top of it because there's no land. New Orleans happened all the time. People's generational houses, gone, right? You think that house is going to be there for X amount of years? I'm telling you, there's a day coming if Jesus tarries where that house will no longer be there. Somebody will say it's old, outdated, and needs to be brought down. Heaven forbid, but I love this beautiful sanctuary. One day, if Jesus tarries, this won't be here. It goes the way of man. Everything, as much as we love these things, they all eventually rust, fade, decay, and destroyed. So what do we do with that? Well, we ultimately have to remember that all these things we're given, they're all about God. And I wrote this down. And this was an ouch to me, all right? So I'm just writing my own ouches as I study this, right? When's the last time when you went to make a purchase, you asked God about it? Ouch. Like, Pastor Bo had an ouch. Like, and I don't know, I can't tell you how far this goes. I don't know that if you go buy shoes, you got to ask God about your shoes, all right? I really don't know, but I can tell you this, that we all have to be careful that the parts of our lives where we have a materialistic thing about us. Some of you may value your vehicles where others say, I don't care about vehicles. Some may value food where others go, I could care less, we're going to do something else with food. I'm not worried about it being fancy. Some of you may value a nice house where others say, I can live in something different. I mean, I'm telling you, you can't look outside of yourself and put it on others. You have to go to your heart and say, okay, what do I value? And is that value tied into some way that God might use this for His good and for His glory in my life? So, you may not be a hoster of your home. I'm not saying everyone in here is wired toward hosting. But are you using your home for impact in God's kingdom? Your business for impact? The things that God gives you, when He calls you to use it, are you using it for Him? I use this about people, but I just want to make sure you're really clear about all this stuff. It's just moving from a position of your heart where the things you have in your life, they're yours. And instead, the things you have in your life are God's. All right? So everything, down to the smallest of item, are you willing to give it up if God asked you to? He might not be asking you to, but are you willing to give it up if God asks you to? That's really the question. I'm going to be real honest with you. As I process that, Pastor Bo's not there yet. There's some things in my life that would be really hard if God asked me to give it up. It'd be really hard to be open-handed about it. Now, some parts of my wiring, the way I was raised and things, man, God's got me as a giver in some aspects of my life, but then in some aspects of my life, I kind of want to do this more. I mean, I'll give you a real think about your children, right? Like there's things that, man, you value. You go, hey, God, if I've got to release Shiloh or Charlie to some part of the world to serve you, or am I willing to do these things? Like there's some things that become really hard that God's entrusted us with. So I don't know, I can't speak to the specifics, but what Jesus is saying here is, are you investing these things in things that last? Treasures in heaven are stored up by obedience to God in all areas of life. They are the reward of the disciple who puts God first. Treasures on earth give no permanent security or satisfaction. They can be destroyed by moths and other vermin. What this author is reminding us is this next point that Jesus is going into, is that when you choose to hold your things like this, you destroy the light in your heart. He talks about inner light, the eyes. Why would he do that in the middle of a materialistic thing? Well, he's talking about how the eye is drawn to buy things. Think about how the marketing world works in our country, right? I mean, constantly. If you watched the game last night with me, you're bombarded with advertisements, right? You are, on things that can make your life better. Whether it's politics or stuff, you're bombarded by things that will make your life better. And you're watching it. You're seeing it. It's always coming in. And what Jesus is reminding us is that if we don't guard the things that we look to, the focuses of our life, no matter if you love Him or not, it can put a dampen on that light in your heart. And I don't want your heart to be consumed by darkness, but the reality is, and the world knows this, materialism, those possessions you buy, will only bring you that joy, that light, for a very, very short time. I don't even know if it's true light, but maybe it's the way the evil one makes us think it's light. But I can tell you this, man, I bought some things and they were fun right as I bought them. But it didn't take, whether it's a vehicle or something smaller, it didn't take many months to where that thing's either dinged or disappointing or not as fun as it used to be. And the reality is this, that fake light that the evil one wants to throw our way with materialism, it fades very quickly. And life is dissatisfying, security is fleeting, and you don't feel the Holy Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit in your life. So Jesus says, hey, if you divide your interests, man, you're not going to be able to do this. So ultimately, it's about serving God. Serving God with our time, our talent, and our treasure. So it's not just about your stuff, but Jesus is focused right now on your money. But the reality is, if you think about the way you pursue money, you have to give time to it. You've got to give your skill to it. And then ultimately, you acquire it, right? Everybody has to give time, something you've trained at, to acquire the resource that you have in this world. And the reality is this, I find a lot of times the reason we disengage with faith or church or things like that is because our time, our talent, and our treasures are locked up into things that we think will satisfy us, and they don't. They let you down. And there are moments in life that will always bring you back to that first love, but if you let those things consume you, your heart will be filled with that darkness that's described. Christian, it should not be so. I'm not saying don't go to work tomorrow. Please go to your jobs. I'm not saying don't acquire and have God bless you with great things. I'm not saying that. But is it for God? Are you doing these things because God has placed you in that workplace with a purpose for your life? He's given you a talent that you can, yes, use to help this world, but also show them that Christians, man, we love. We're about the things of God and we matter. And then are you using your treasure? Yes, tithe, give to the church. I mean, our treasure's sitting right here. I'd be amiss to not say things like that. But like at the end of the day, it really goes beyond the religious practice, right? I mean, yes, give to the church. But if you're disciplined in that, let me ask you, how are you being generous in other ways? And I'll be real honest with you, sometimes as a pastor, we obviously need your tithes, but I need your time too. I need you to devote some time to helping and to helping this place. And yes, it may not be always in the way in which you thought you should serve. Are you open-handed? What I love is when I encounter people, and some of you are this way, man, I love people that say, how can I help? And when I give them the assignment, they say, yes, Pastor. With all my heart, I'll do it. Not, Pastor, here's what I want to do. Here's what I feel like God's saying. No, I'll do it. I'm able. I'll help you. It's not so much the disciples' wealth that Jesus is concerned with as is his loyalty to Jesus. As verse 24 will make explicit, materialism is in direct conflict with loyalty to God. The danger of amassing possessions is that the treasure will command the disciples' loyalty, and that material affluence will breed materialism. So listen, if you have a lot in this room, if God has blessed you, it's not that you've done anything wrong. It's not that he's saying you're evil or that you can't come to Jesus. Instead, what he's saying to you is this: watch out for materialism. Watch out for the love of things, because it will let you down. It's not so much that we build great churches. It's not so much that we have a lot of money in the bank. It's not that at all. It's that ultimately it's not about the church. It's not about Jesus. It's not about any of that. It's about you. Jesus knows it's for your best that you would pursue Him and not let your heart be tied to anything. So whether your heart is built up on a treasure of fake religion, inauthentic worship, or whether your heart is full of the stuff that can satisfy outside of religion, material possessions, Jesus says bring that all to the foot of the cross and ultimately build your life upon treasures that matter. And those of you in here who have done this, you have testimony of what God will do. He will do things that blow your mind. He will come through in ways you never dreamed possible. He will provide in ways that you never thought possible. He will allow you to be a part of a mission that is greater than yourself if you will let that stuff rest at the foot of Jesus. So the question before you today is, are you going to build a basement of Beanie Babies in your faith life that have no value, that rose up one day of value and died the next? Or are you going to build a treasure in your basement that matters, of faith, of love, of good conscience? And ultimately, I pray your basement is filled with the things that Jesus provides. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. My prayer for all of us is that our basements are filled with these things. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for your word. And God, I thank you that even though your word sometimes causes us to have to evaluate, God, I know that we're here to do so. And I pray today that if anyone's struggling with something we talked about today, God, they would not feel judgment at all, because Jesus, you didn't come to judge in the sense of making us feel guilty in ways that we can't overcome. Jesus, you came to give us the power to overcome these things. So I pray today that we would rest in your strength and your goodness, and know that if there's secret places in our lives that we're still holding on with closed fists, Jesus, you came alongside us to open up those fists to you. So I pray today, God, that we would live open-handed lives, lives that count, that matter, and ultimately, God, we would see you do some wonderful things because we live these open-handed lives. We give this stuff to you, God, and I pray today that we will live for you. In Jesus' name, amen. The strength you need to do these things, it happens with Jesus. So if you need to know Jesus today as your Savior and Lord, if you don't have a time where you know you've made a commitment to Him, Pastor Ron is right over here. We would love to talk with you about that, because you really can't get there without Jesus. That's what you'll see throughout the Bible. So make sure you stop by Ron, talk with him. Pastor Ron would love to help you know how to have a relationship with Jesus. There's a few things going on in our church life that I want to make you aware of before we close today. First is this: Mercedes and family, we're so grateful to see you. So grateful to see you. We've been praying for all of you. We love you. We're so glad you're here. And baby Skylar's good to see her as well. I mean, what a blessing. And man, we won't go more on that because I could lose it right there. To let you know, though, also, we did have a loss in the church family this week. Casey Cleveland's husband, Keith, if you know Casey, he passed away this week after a battle in his health. And so we've been praying for them for a while. It actually started when we were coming home from Romania. We got the news on Keith and been praying for them, but he did pass away this last week. So be praying for Casey, and we'll be, I believe the funeral's off-site. It's not in town, right, Chester? So, but if we do have some details, we'll pass them along if you do want to make the drive, but it's going to be up where she's living now. But we did want to make you aware of that. And along with that, I think Casey would want us to mention next week is our Mission Sunday. So we're going to be celebrating not only what God's done this last year, but we're also going to launch out our new mission opportunities next year. Casey's a huge part of Romania. I actually have a relationship longer with Casey because of our trips together. And so that's what's so wonderful about mission work. And we're going to be sharing about that next week. So you want to be in church next week. You want to be around because we've got some special things planned for that Sunday. And I know she would want you to be invested and interested in what God's doing through missions as well. So be praying for Casey, but also to ask your prayers as we plan and pray about what God will do with us all across the world this next year. And so it's a really amazing time. With all that being said, let's stand together. Don't forget to drop off your tithes and offerings as you go, and let's go fellowship with one another in the lobby and then on to our connection classes.